which Judas Priest album is the best? Is it Painkiller, British Steel, or possibly the underrated debut Rocka Rolla? With all due respect, no, it's not. Despite being one of the biggest Judas Priest nerds on YouTube, I never really released any of those popular ranking all Judas Priest albums videos on the show.
Killer metal album.
So today I'll explain why it was so, and then map out all of the Judas Priest records. Yes, including the upcoming album, Invincible Shield. Here you go. Just to make it clear, this won't really be a regular ranking video in which you simply select which album is superior to another, because when it comes to Judas Priest, it is rather unfair to do so. Unlike with many other iconic bands, for example like with my beloved Motorhead, who were able to keep the essence of their early sound throughout their entire career. So there you would just select the album which you like the most. And it's very easy. Overkill. But in all fairness, one of the things we all love about Judas Priest is the whole fact that throughout their career, they never stopped evolving and changing from a record to a record, resulting with not even two of their albums sounding the same. Not even the ones which were released in the same year. And each of those albums played a crucial role in the development of not only the Judas Priest sound, but that of the sound of the entire heavy metal as a genre. Its style, image, and even determined the direction in which it will go after it. And so a Judas Priest album ranking video simply has to have slightly more edges than that of most other heavy metal bands. So let's start at the very beginning. Rocka Rolla became not only the band's very first studio album, but also to this very day remains the most overlooked record in the entire Judas Priest catalog. And not really as much by the fans as it is by the band themselves. And here's the thing, I think most people who are not new to the channel know that I actually do love Rocka Rolla. I actually think that the songwriting on this record is amazing. Yet, in all fairness, given its original production, it most likely is actually very rightful for the band to do so. And yet, it was the first truly necessary Judas Priest record. By 1974, Judas Priest were well into the 5th year of their existence as a band. And so I'd argue that if the boys would not have rushed to release Rocka Rolla in September of 74, and even more, if they would have been able to achieve the exact sound that they originally wanted, which would have resulted in Rocka Rolla being received much better by the fans, Judas Priest might have never gotten to the heights they are at today, and their music might have gotten in a completely different direction, slowly losing the heaviness and the aggression we know Judas Priest for. So yes, it's very simple. Without Rocka Rolla, there would have never been Judas Priest. So it is indeed a necessary album in the Judas Priest discography. And by the way, this year, Rocka Rolla will be celebrating its 50th anniversary. And I know that the band hasn't advertised it much yet, but a little birdie told me that Judas Priest team has prepared something truly extraordinary for all of the die-hard Priest fans. So I personally simply cannot wait for this September to add something new to my Rocka Rolla collection. By the time Sad Wings of Destiny was ready, Rob Halford infamously started telling the fans from the stage that soon they will be burning their copies of Rocka Rolla, for he truly believed that it is on the next Priest album that the band has finally found its sound. And it is true, it was on Sad Wings of Destiny that Judas Priest finally found the sound they were looking for since 1969. A sound which, in a nutshell, was basically a definition of the entire heavy metal of the 1970s, with all its gloomy atmosphere, darkness, and heaviness at the same time. Whiskey woman, don't you know that you are driving me insane? And here's the thing, Sad Wings of Destiny is actually one of my favorite albums. And not only in the Judas Priest discography, overall. And if we're actually being fair, that in terms of its sound, it was actually miles away from Judas Priest's debut. But it wasn't really on Sad Wings of Destiny that Judas Priest finally broke the rules and reshaped and redefined heavy metal, but rather the opposite. It actually became somewhat of a summary of everything this genre has represented in that decade. An album on which the band knew exactly how they wanted to sound, and unlike on their debut, they were actually able to achieve it. So I would have to put it in a category called Riding on the Wind. A category which will include some of the strongest Priest records in my opinion, including my absolute favorite one. And the same goes for the next Judas Priest album, Sin After Sin, which in my opinion became a natural continuation, a progression of the sound they were able to achieve on Sad Wings of Destiny, although much more fine-tuned and refined, partially thanks to the incredible job done by Roger Glover. And yet, even though it goes to the same category in the sterilization or mapping of the Judas Priest albums, it in no way sounds the same to Sad Wings of Destiny. And it of course includes several mind-blowing tweaks, which went way ahead of its time. I mean, you know, it basically became a prototype for thrash metal. By the way, guys, I just wanted to point out that I'm deliberately not placing these categories one on top of the other, just to show that it doesn't necessarily mean that one is imperatively better than the other, although of course it may seem so depending on your preferences, and also to show that each of those was actually crucial for the development of the Judas Priest sound we know today. And so the necessary category, even though it may seem that it might contain some weaker albums, is actually the one without which this band simply would not have existed. Riding on the Wind contains some of the strongest Judas Priest albums, which either right away or will eventually cement Judas Priest's status as an ultimate heavy metal band. And the category in which the next album will fall is the one on which Judas Priest will go against the grain, eventually reshaping the genre as we know it. I'll be damned. Here comes the ghost again. On Stained Glass, Judas Priest cranked their creativeness to 11.
These go to 11.
Deviating from a heavy metal sound which has become a standard for the genre by then, and making a leap of faith, presenting a completely new side of metal, which wasn't really done or heard by anyone before. Stained Glass became the album which has broken all of the canons of metal as it was known by then, making it much more sharp, aggressive and straight to the point, becoming a record which eventually became an encouragement for the development of the entire new wave of British heavy metal movement, inspiring dozens if not hundreds of young musicians all around the United Kingdom to pick up their instruments and start a heavy metal journey of their own. And Killing Machine, which was released as Hellbent for Leather in the United States, and which, by the way, is the only Judas Priest album which was released as the same year as its predecessor, has continued that process of reshaping heavy metal. This time also gave metalheads something they never had before: a unique look. Machine, whether you like it or not, is in fact one of the most important albums for heavy metal overall. It is the album which, together with its predecessor, has further bridged the gap between the sinister appeal of the early and dark heavy metal sound and the aggression and fun of punk rock, eventually placing heavy metal on the radar of mainstream media, and by that somewhat stealing punk rock's thunder for at least the next decade. So yes, in my opinion, Killing Machine should definitely join Stained Glass in the Breaking the Law category, as who knows, maybe without these two records there is actually a chance that metal would never actually have found out that it can have so many different shapes and forms. So I guess it is kind of ironic that in my ranking, the next Judas Priest album will actually not be featured in that same category. British Steel is one of the most important and quintessential albums in the entire Judas Priest career. It features some of the biggest hits ever written in the genre, without which you simply cannot imagine a Judas Priest show. That's when I'll make my moves right. By 1980, Judas Priest were untouchable in the world of metal. By then, they've already become the biggest heavy metal band on the planet, thanks to the enormous success of Unleashed in the East, which has become platinum, and also due to the turbulence some of the other bands in the genre started experiencing back then. And Priest have used the momentum to the fullest. British Steel features some of the biggest hits the band has ever written during their career, and weirdly enough includes both those accessible tracks which received a lot of radio play in 1980 and do that even now, and also some of the heaviest bangers, including, for example, Metallica's favorite Rapid Fire. And so British Steel is somewhat in between the two different categories for me. It could easily be placed into the Riding on the Wind one, for if we're being very fair, despite it definitely being innovative, it has somewhat continued the line established by Stained Glass and Killing Machine, polishing their sound to an absolute perfection. And so it would have actually gotten into that category if not for the most important purpose British Steel has served for the band. It has skyrocketed Judas Priest to the mainstream, converting it from one of the biggest heavy metal bands on the planet to one of the biggest bands on the planet. By the way, guys, you might have noticed that I kind of skipped one of the greatest heavy metal albums of all times, Unleashed in the East, in this ranking. And this was actually done rather deliberately because I wanted to make sure that we're only talking about the Judas Priest studio albums. I know what you're thinking about now. But nevertheless, the purpose of this particular video is, of course, to talk about my personal perception of the new songs introduced by a band on each of their records. And yes, it is, of course, true that it is Unleashed in the East, which has presented the early Judas Priest catalog in a completely new light for all of the band's fans. I still would like to stick only to the records which contain brand new tracks for the purpose of this particular video. But yeah, if Unleashed in the East would have made it here, it would have definitely shared the category together with British Steel. Point of Entry is a rather weird album. I mean, honestly, when you talk to most Judas Priest fans, realistically, not many name it among their favorite. And yet, at the same time, Point of Entry features some amazing tracks, which are truly loved by all Judas Priest fans. And yet, if we're being very honest, Point of Entry is not perfect. First of all, while it definitely does feature some amazing bangers, most fans would agree that not all tracks on this record are up there on the same level. But its biggest problem is not even that. In 1981, Judas Priest were given a task to replicate the success of British Steel while being absolutely drained and not given much time to recharge their batteries. And so Point of Entry becomes the first and one of the few Judas Priest albums on which the band decided to play it safe.
It cannot be.
And let's be honest here, this is not really something that we expect this band to do. But at the same time, I truly believe that if this record would have been released by any other metal band, it would have been considered absolutely amazing. And so Point of Entry's biggest problem is the whole fact that it is a Judas Priest album, and already by then it was compared to such masterpieces as British Steel, Killing Machine, or Sad Wings of Destiny. Screaming for Vengeance to this very day remains one of the most beloved Judas Priest albums among all of the band's fans, and it definitely is one of the most commercially successful records this band has ever released, bringing them mind-blowing record sales all across the globe. The secret of Screaming for Vengeance's success is in the whole fact that it was able to capture the essence of the early 80s heavy metal while still containing some radio-friendly mainstream hits, thus helping this record not simply repeat but also exceed the success of British Steel. But at the same time, it did not really bring Judas Priest to the mainstream. Quite the opposite. It was able to help heavy metal interest the mainstream, and together with several other albums from other bands, helped make metal sexy and hot among much wider audiences. And given the whole fact that this record actually contains a song titled Riding on the Wind, we simply have no other choice but to include it in this category. Defenders of the Faith is... oh, come on, I cannot find anything controversial. It is amazing! For some reason, some fans do believe that it is a younger brother, sometimes overshadowed by Screaming for Vengeance, yet the truth is that it is actually my favorite Judas Priest record. It is the album I got introduced Judas Priest to. It is the first Judas Priest record I bought with my own money, and it is this album with which I was waiting for Judas Priest under a hotel at the very first Priest show I ever got to go to. And this is the album they signed for me back then. The memory I still cherish to this very day. So yeah, if you want to know my opinion, it is my favorite Priest album. Although, weirdly enough, it does not actually mean that it is the strongest record this band has ever released. But when it comes to me, I love it the most, so we kind of have to show it somehow on the screen here. And when it comes to the category with which to relate it, I think it would be absolutely fair that it should go into the same category as Screaming for Vengeance, as the band was truly riding on the winds of success when they were releasing Defenders of the Faith in 1984. Turbo is one of those records which everyone loves to hate. Just like with Iron Maiden Somewhere in Time, which was released the same year, it initially has gotten a lot of crap from the fans for bringing synthesizers into heavy metal. You know, like if they were the first ones to do that. But the funniest thing is that that dislike goes on only until you hear the intro to Turbo Lover at a Priest show. But the actual truth is that Turbo was a huge success. It has not only become one of the best sold Judas Priest albums, but also was able to introduce this band to an absolutely new fan base. And KK Downing himself actually remembers that before 1986, the Priest crowd mostly consisted of men and some of their girlfriends who had to come to their shows. But in 1986, everything has changed, as their music has suddenly resonated with an absolutely different layer of society. And thus, I guess most would agree that it would be absolutely fair that it would place Turbo into the mainstream category alongside the 1980, the infamous British Steel. By the way, guys, I rarely do that because I kind of feel weird about it. But here, just real quick, I just wanted to give a shout out and just say thank you to everyone who's been supporting me on Patreon. And also to everyone who's purchased, some Metal Pilgrim merch to rock out at the next Judas Priest show. Guys, just know that your support means the world to me, and it really helps me producing this content, and is actually very and very valuable. So just from the bottom of my heart, thank you, guys. I always loved Ram It Down. No, let me rephrase it. I always loved the songwriting on Ram It Down. Yes, I actually think that it is a great record, and I would absolutely love it if more people would appreciate it. Yet, at the same time, I do agree that first of all, some of the production could have been better, and secondly, given the whole fact that Ram It Down was originally supposed to be the second part of the twin Turbo albums, and the label kind of has forced the band to split it into two, and then the band was given very harsh deadlines to finish this record. It is one of those albums on which Judas Priest decided to play it safe. And yet, once again, this shouldn't really be read as an evaluation of Ram It Down, and you will see that one of my favorite Priest records will actually fall into this category. Yet, in all fairness, realistically speaking, it is actually one of those records on which Judas Priest did not really push their own boundaries, or did not do that enough. And I actually always thought that it would be absolutely kick-ass if after Scott Travis joined Judas Priest, the band would have re-recorded this record anew, showcasing to the fans how many incredible bangers it actually has on it. And thus we come to everyone's beloved Painkiller. Now, you already know that my favorite Judas Priest album is actually Defenders of the Faith, so that spot is kind of taken. But at the same time, and I do understand that it may sound somewhat contradictory, I consider Painkiller to be one of the best albums in metal ever.
Yeah, unbelievable.
No, seriously, if someone asked me, show me what metal is, just give me one record which defines metal, I would definitely, without any thoughts, give them Painkiller. Because for me, this record does in fact unite everything metal stands for. And maybe that's why it is actually loved and appreciated by the fans of different subgenre of our favorite music. And now, keep in mind that Painkiller was released right after Ram It Down, which, in all fairness, was not really received that well by all of the fans, and Turbo, which means that it was released at a time when some metalheads dared to say that Judas Priest are no longer relevant in the world of metal.
It's just outrageous.
And it was then when the band decided to take a break, somewhat disappearing from the face of the earth, and then out of the blue come back with something which has shown everyone how it's done. Now, I actually released a very long episode about Painkiller in the past, so I'm not gonna talk about how, it has influenced the genre overall, but given everything I just said, I believe that it doesn't actually belong to any of the categories we used so far. And so for this record, and for now for this record alone, I actually have to create a special category titled How the F Can You Do That? For the band's unprecedented evolution, which has put all of their critics to shame, and at least for now, Painkiller will have to reside alone in this category. By 1997, Judas Priest were given a pretty much impossible task as they were standing on the crossroads. Now, keep in mind, 7 years after the release of Painkiller, Judas Priest were pretty much no more. Yes, this band has pretty much stopped or paused its existence for several years as Rob Halford continued his solo journey and Glenn Tipton explored some new horizons with his records.
It's immortal sin.
And yet in October of 97, Judas Priest returned with their 13th album, Jugulator. The album which is naturally being received with quite mixed feelings by many Judas Priest fans. Yet I said it once, and I'll say it again. Without this record, there would have been no Judas Priest today.
You're going to burn in hell!
The truth is, the Jugulator actually features some amazing tracks, and if it would have been released by pretty much any other of the 1990s metal bands, people would still be talking about how freaking amazing it is, and that band would most likely be able to live just off this record alone. But once again, its most important role and its purpose is that it has saved Judas Priest as a band, and thus it definitely goes into the necessary category as a record which has brought Judas Priest back on the map.
Have you got a gun? Do you remember well?
And the same of course goes for Demolition, which just as Iron Maiden's Virtual 11 cemented the band's return and showcased that Judas Priest will carry on and that Glenn Tipton and KK Downen still have a lot left to say in the world of metal.
I am your worst demise, or a cut your big words down the side.
Angel of Retribution is one of my favorite Judas Priest albums. Seriously. I still remember when I first found out that Rob Halford is back in the band, how excited I was to hear Angel of Retribution first and how I was getting ready to see Judas Priest live for the very first time as the Metal Gods announced their first ever coming to Kyiv, Ukraine. And so yes, that intro and that piercing scream of Rob Halford in Judas Rising still gets me every time. And that's why Angel of Retribution is definitely among one of my favorite Priest records. And here's the thing, remember a couple of minutes ago I did promise you that one of my favorite records, which will actually make it to a category which some people might have considered as the weak one, yet as if to show that this is not so, I would like to make a case that on Angel of Retribution, Judas Priest wrote amazing songs, making it one of my favorite Judas Priest albums. And they did it in a very safe manner, continuing exactly where they left off on Painkiller and giving their fans exactly what they want, thus making it to our play it safe category, which once again is a very respectable place to be.
Judas is right.
On Nostradamus, Judas Priest did something they never ever did before, and unfortunately I don't think that it will ever do once again. Made a leap of faith and wrote a conceptual double LP about one of the most controversial figures in medieval European history. Now, I have to be honest with you, when it came out, I actually listened to it on repeat several hundred times, thinking to myself that, well, this does not sound like the Judas Priest I know, and yet it still feels Judas Priest, and I don't know why, but despite me not really liking such conceptual albums usually, I absolutely love it, and I cannot stop listening to it. But realistically speaking, Nostradamus did not actually become one of the most beloved Judas Priest albums among the fanbase. Yet what it did is definitely deserved a spot together with Stay in Class and Killing Machine in our Breaking the Law category. As on this record, Judas Priest once again did something they never did before and pushed the boundaries of their own sound to the maximum. And the truth is that I would actually love to see Judas Priest perform Nostradamus in its entirety live at some point in the future. Although I do understand that this most likely is very unrealistic. But who knows? Maybe 20 years down the road, Nostradamus will actually become a metal opera it was always meant to be.
I am Nostradamus. You believe.
Redeemer of Souls did for Judas Priest exactly the same thing Jugulator did for the band several years before. I still remember going to the Epitaph tour in Massachusetts and thinking to myself, I cannot believe this is it. I simply couldn't believe that this was the end of one of the greatest heavy metal bands when I believe that they still had so much to say. And yet with the departure of the founding member, KK Downing, and with the announcement of the Epitaph tour, which was a retrospective tour going through the entire history of this band, many fans simply made peace with it. But then we realized that Richie Faulkner was not simply a touring musician, and that the Falcon was ready to bring the new spark of life into the band. And so yes, without any doubts or hesitation, Redeemer of Souls goes into our necessary category, for it has brought Judas Priest back from the void, for which we are eternally thankful to Redeemer of Souls. And then came Firepower, the album which has proven that despite being more than 40 years old, this band still has so much power, vigor, and energy that it is still ready to show most of the young bands how it's done.
Like a thief in the night.
Firepower perfectly mixed the old schoolness of the Judas Priest sound with the modern production and tendencies in metal, rapidly becoming one of the most favorite Judas Priest albums for many of the band's die-hard fans, which, let's be honest here, with by then 18 albums in their catalog, it kind of says a lot about the quality of this record. And so I believe it would be absolutely fair that Firepower, without any doubt, would go into the Riding on the Wind category. For despite not really breaking the laws of heavy metal or having the achievement of bringing this band into the mainstream, because by now I don't think that any album can bring this band into the mainstream more than it already is in there. Firepower once again summed up everything we want to hear from a heavy metal record, a classic heavy metal record in the 21st century, as the band seemed to know exactly what their fans want to hear and how they would like to sound and represent themselves in a new modern age.
Chasing a dream as I go higher, waiting at me, my heart's on fire.
And thus we finally come to the newest addition to the band's long catalog, the band's 19th studio album, Invincible Shield. By the way, if you watched this video up until now without skipping, well, kudos to you. Thank you so much for doing this. This means a lot to me. This is very helpful for the channel, and I am just very thankful that you value my opinion so much that you watched me talk through the entire Judas Priest catalog for I don't know how many minutes this video is going on for already. Oh my god. But we're here. And as I told Rob Halford in our recent interview, which if you're not too tired of me by now, you should definitely watch after this video if you haven't seen it yet. But nevertheless, hearing a new record by one of your favorite bands is one of the most terrifying experiences ever. Because you constantly think, what if I don't like it? What if I hate a new Judas Priest or Iron Maiden or Metallica album? Like, this is the end of me as I know it. And yet, Invincible Shield has blown me away.
Can you believe that?
No, I cannot say that it is one of my favorite Judas Priest albums. I don't think that my favorite Judas Priest album can ever change because, once again, I love Defenders of the Faith not as much for its composition as for the emotional connection I have with this record, and nothing can take that away. But at the same time, Invincible Shield is something I definitely did not expect to hear from the band at its 54th year of existence.
Heavy is the crown of thorns that rests upon this head.
On Invincible Shield, Judas Priest do not play it safe. And at the same time, they're not really breaking the law or experimenting to the point where you simply do not recognize the band's sound. But at the same time, they have so much energy and so much freshness in their sound that it is simply unbelievable that a band of such status still has so much will and potential to bring the best of the Judas Priest style heavy metal for all of their die-hard fans around the world. And so I'm very happy to say that from now on, given my weird theorization, or not really theorization, mapping of Judas Priest records, for the first time ever, Painkiller is no longer alone in how the f can you do that category. But anyways, what do you guys think about this really weird mapping of Judas Priest albums that I just rambled on for I don't know how many minutes here? Please let us know in the comments. And also, how would you place those records within those 6 different categories? Now, this was super fun, and I would actually love to do the same exercise with some other band. I think we all know which one we're talking about next.
Yep.
So while you're down there in the comments, please also let me know whether I should do that or not. But meanwhile, thank you so much for watching this video, guys, and thank you so much for supporting me, this show, and Ukraine through this very, very difficult time. We will prevail. Slava Ukraini!